They are on welfare, et tu Jew, and they venture out only infrequently to buy food. The trip to the store is not a simple thing it is for the resident of more fortunate neighborhoods. Will the elderly Jew manage to return safely with all limbs intact? It is not an academic question for denizens of the urban jungle. And so they buy things like matzot and powdered milk, things that keep, so that the trips to the stores may be as infrequent as possible. Most synagogues are closed, or services are infrequent, for to go beyond the closed, locked, buried, and bolted door is to risk too much. And so these elderly and poverty-stricken Jews live out their desperate lives in misery and fear. They are the only Jews left in certain areas because, ironically, all the other Jews fled long ago. What other Jews? Those who now reside in nice neighborhoods, those who are wealthier and younger and so much more fortunate, those who belong to all the Jewish organizations that bleed for everyone else, those liberals who ran away to the safe areas from whence they pontificate to the elderly and poor they left behind. Integrate. But who cares about this? What Jewish organization is seized by an overwhelming need to hurriedly reorder its priorities so that these elderly Jews may be relocated in other areas? One does not speak of those high-income luxury neighborhoods in which the Jewish establishment is in second. But surely there are apartments in lower middle-class neighborhoods where a rent subsidy can grant a poverty-ridden elderly Jew a few last years of safety, Jewish activity and meaning to his life. But who cares? More, there are thousands of low-income Jewish parents who are appalled at the state of the public schools their children attend, terrified by the physical danger in these schools and frightened at the thought that their children will drift away from Jewish ties. They desperately seek entry for their children into Jewish parochial schools, yeshivas. The latter, choked by inflationary pressures and huge deficits, are forced to charge the kind of tuition fees that are out of reach of the poor Jewish family. The result is that these needy poor Jewish children are deprived of the right to a maximum Jewish education and are forced to endure the kind of hell that wealthy Jewish parents' children in the suburban public schools or in the city private schools can escape. But who among our Jewish establishment gives a Jewish damn? What Jewish group cares enough about this most desperate of Jewish problems that holds within it the very future of Jewish survival as Jews in America? Who cares enough to see to it that scholarships and tuition subsidies are granted to these poor needy Jewish children so that they might attend a Jewish day school? The huge federations in Jewish communities have money for all manner of nonsense. Their order of priorities is one that calls for the Jewish education to receive the jackal share of the wealth. They have Jewish funds to give to Jewish hospitals whose clientele is predominantly non-Jewish. Indeed, one of the great puzzles of our time is what makes a hospital Jewish, particularly when it is not even kosher. They have Jewish funds to give to summer camps, community centers, and boys' clubs whose participants are so often Gentile and which serve all too often as convenient places for intermarriage. We have Jewish funds for basketball and basket waving and all sorts of vapid foolishness. But for Jewish education, the one thing that will stop the cancer of Jewish alienation, intermarriage, and assimilation, we can find little or no funds. Indeed, the opposite is true. When the desperate up against the wall yeshivas finally see some ray of hope, When suddenly the federal and state government find a way to give money to the secular aspects of the yeshiva curriculum, or when they grant tuition subsidies to individual students, those same Jewish groups who sat by and refused to give Jewish money suddenly awake from the dead. With shouts of moral outrage, they come to the aid of the Constitution, separation of church and state, save the republic. Suddenly, the lawyers who cannot be found to go to court for individual Jewish problems descend in hordes to make sure that no government money goes to aid the hard-pressed yeshiva. It is not strange. The Jewish establishment is opposed, in principle, to the Jewish yeshiva. It is too Jewish. It is too parochial. It prevents integration of the Jew with the non-Jew. It flies in the face of the first commandment, melt. It is a thing to be abhorred. The yeshiva is no friend of the Jewish establishment because it reveals its nakedness of Jewish soul and its paucity of Jewish knowledge. So who will fight the good Jewish fight and grant the poor Jewish child the means to receive a Jewish education? Who will demand that the Jew get his proper share of anti-poverty funds and jobs? Who will help stamp out the hoodlumism and racism that threatens Jews physically? Who will relocate the elderly and poor Jews from the neighborhoods of violence and nightmare? If not the Jew, who? If not the Jewish establishment whose raison d'etre is to aid Jews, who? And if not now, when? And above all, if Jews do not do these things, why? There are other Jewish problems about which those who live in the solitude of the gilded get to know little and care less. In Scarsdale or Shecker Heights or Great Neck or Newton or Elkins Park, it is pleasant to walk in the streets, the gardens and the shopping malls. The statistics of manslaughter, mugging, rape, purse snatching, robbery and burglary have little meaning for practitioners of the good life. For Jews in less fortunate circumstances, however, it is not that simple. Such people know the gnawing uncertainty of waiting for a youngster who is late in returning from school. In nice areas, it is merely a question of whether he went to the home of a friend or to the library. In other neighborhoods, the darkness is a demon that brings with it fears and trepidations, and where frightened residents see shadows lurking in every corner. All too often, it is not their imagination. The terror of the streets, fear that keeps store doors locked and makes everyone who knocks the subject of keen scrutiny so as to ascertain whether he is customer or robber. The vandalizing of synagogues and Jewish institutions and attacks upon Jews returning from home, the robbing of and assaults upon children in public schools, the breaking into and the ransacking of private apartments, all these realities are the flesh and blood that comprise the skeletal stories that the more fortunate only read of in their daily newspapers. In a word, they make up the nightmare of crime and violence. There are neighborhoods throughout the major urban areas where Jews live in terror of crime and violence. If one seeks the affirmation of the biblical curse, in the morning thou shalt say, would God it were evening. And at evening they shall say, would God it were morning. Let him speak to people in these urban neighborhoods, whom too many of us never see, and whose particular adventures we never experience. The elevator in an apartment building becomes a dreaded thing, and the dark halls a heaven for muggers and worse. The walk to the synagogue for the evening prayers becomes a rare event for the frightened Jew, and soon those evening prayers are delivered to God while still daylight, in order that the supplicant arrive home and lock himself in his caged prison before darkness traps him on the streets. For the youngster with his skull cap, returning from yeshiva or playing ball in the park, there is the constant physical assault nurtured by the image of the Jew as a weak, frightened, easy mark. The public school for a young Jewish boy becomes the dreaded thing, too, and he learns to control his kidneys because the bathroom has become a place of danger. Extortion of money and food becomes commonplace. Hatred, suspicion and fear fills the whole of education, while a weak and paralyzed principal attempts to keep things quiet, lest his record be marred as one of who is incapable of keeping things under control. Teacher and administrators both play out each day in grim anticipation of the great moment of retirement. Merchants leave their homes much the same as peace offers, not totally sure what the day will bring, or whatever they will not fall victim that day to the robber or dope addict. At the best, they are certain that the day of assault is eventually due to touch them. At worst, they fear that more than their property will be taken. Unable to obtain insurance, they sit in their stores, warily eyeing those who enter and fearful of pilferage and vandalism. The Jewish merchant in the non-Jewish ghetto areas fares even worse. His plea grows steadily more desperate, for not only are all the curses that plague other merchants visited upon him with even greater terror, but in addition he is the target of extortion, rioting, looting and burning, as well as being the victim of a campaign by local groups to drive him out of their community. The Jew who founded his business and worked long hours and days and years to make it grow, the Jew who was there long before most of the present-day residents had arrived, is the victim of tiny veiled attempt to drive out all people who are of the wrong ethnic complexion. And let us remember that many of those Jews who suffers are so often the little people. Some are immigrants and survivors of the death camps. Many are owners of neighborhood papa-mama stores who spend long hours trying to save a little money. They too seek to climb the same ladder or of success as their fellow Jews who now live in nice neighborhoods and who do not care about them. No one cares about them. Politicians sit and watch the agony of the Jewish victims of crime and prefer not to cause problems by taking the necessary harsh line of defense. Police, with eloquence born of long practice, deliver the line that will someday be engraved mandatorily on the tombstone of every officer. We don't have enough men. It is so much easier to avoid problems by ignoring the cries of the victims. After all, others may riot if dealt with harshly, but Jews with bitter resignation accept their lot without a furor. The Jew can expect precise little help from the wealthy non-Jewish liberal establishment, which will always sympathize with the disadvantaged and give them that which is not theirs to give away. They will always be tolerant of those who burn and loot someone else's property. Far better to rob a small Jewish merchant in Harlem than to have acts of violence deflected to the stock exchange or a large Ford Motor dealership. Far better for Jewish merchants and property owners to suffer than for a mayor who desires to be president to upset his political ambitions. getting tough with minorities, move voters, could ruin his image as a man who keeps things under control. And so no one cares about the merchants who have been wiped out by arsonists on an individual basis, or the merchants who have been hurt by riots and looters in a general orgy of destruction. A Jewish merchant can see a lifetime of work destroyed in a few hours, and no one will care. If the very reason for the existence of government is to secure the lives and property of its citizens, then government has failed miserable. If Freeman long ago made a social contract with authority whereby he gave up certain freedoms for the right to be secure, all are agreed that for the poor Jew it was a bad deal. The resident of the lower-income Jewish neighborhoods is subjected to regular fear of attacks on his body and property. It is not a pleasant thing, nor is it a thing that the Jewish organizations have done a thing about. What Jewish organization has so understood the terror of the streets, schools, stores and homes in oppressed Jewish neighborhoods that it has set up an urgent, well-financed program of safety? What traditional Jewish group has taken up the cause of Jewish physical safety with the same zeal and energy that is normally reserved for non-Jewish social and economic causes? What major Jewish organization with its prestigious New York City Upper East Side address and its executives who live in areas safer than the inner city once of the little Jew, has called for mass demonstrations and sent its leaders into the streets with angry protests? What Jewish leader has decreed that his group will set aside funds for safety patrols so that the people of the neighborhood can have the means to make the streets as safe as those on Long Island or in Beverly Hills? What Jewish organization has made the safety of Jewish bodies, synagogues, institutions, streets, schools, stores, and property the subject of major top priority and the recipient of large sums of money? None. And we have an obligation to ask why. With an arrogance and lack of feeling that is unworthy of descendants of Abraham's, major Jewish groups have summarily rejected all requests for funds to fight crime with the incredible statement, "Go to the police. This is their job." How sublimely ignorant and how obscenely unfeeling. The poor Jew in the poor and oppressed areas has gone to the police 1,000 times, and 1,000 times he has been left unsatisfied. Perhaps the police in Westchester or Evanston come promptly. In Williamsburg, Crown Heights, or Chicago's West Side, it takes time, and the hoodlum is rarely found. And if Jews, without the aid of major Jewish groups, decide on their own initiative to help themselves be safe from murder, rape, and assault, those Jewish leaders who did not feel the obligation to help lack even the decency not to hurt. The thought of Jewish self-help is unadmissible to them, and they make their objections known. Safety patrols, vigilantes, anti-crime unit, violently taking the law into your own hands. How sad that one who cannot feel someone else's pain should try to prevent the one who does relieving it. What an orphan generation we are to be burdened with leaders who say such thing as, and then add, furthermore, this is not a Jewish problem. Others, read except us, suffer too. There are few more outrageous arguments than the one uttered over and over again by Jewish leaders and groups protesting. Such and such an action is not really a Jewish problem. It is aimed at a class of people which merely includes Jews in their ranks. So we find that assaults of merchants who are predominantly Jewish do not comprise a Jewish issue. That reverse discrimination and quotas that effectively hit Jewish students, businessmen and workers more than others are not really a Jewish problem. That crime in Jewish neighborhoods is not really aimed at the Jews as such and is therefore not a Jewish problem. There is irony in these arguments coming from groups and men who, in the Jewish name, take sides on such Jewish issues as Vietnam, the Christmas stamp, abortion reform, South Africa, and the Electoral College. There is also tragedy. It is the tragedy of lack of sensitivity to Jewish pain, of the de-Judaizing of Jewish problems, of the moral bankruptcy of the Jewish establishment. If Jews, as part of a general injustice or general harassment or general persecution, suffer, that is a Jewish problem precisely because Jews are involved. Whether de jure or de facto, it is immaterial to the sensitive Jew, to the one who is consumed by Ahavat Israel. The trouble is that our Jewish leaders are assimilated Jews, Jews who have lost touch with the common Jew. They are attempting to subtly melt into the Gentile background. Had they lived in Tsarist Russia, they would have stated that the general Russian campaign to Russianize all minorities within their borders, including Poles, Ukrainians, and White Russians, as well as Jews, was not a Jewish problem. Woe unto all people with such leaders. This is not to say that other peoples do not suffer from crime. It is not to say that others do not suffer violence, but for Jewish groups to use this as an excuse not to deal with crime and violence against Jews in Jewish neighborhoods, it is inexcusable. And the fear that flows from the crime and the violence into the hearts of the Jews of these stricken neighborhoods becomes a flood of panic. Jews begin to sell their homes and move out of their apartments. They leave their neighborhoods where they lived for years and where they built their lives and gave of their sweat and toil. They flee the place they called home for so long and leave behind all their synagogues, community centers, schools and institutions that cannot be rebuilt again for tens of millions of dollars. And of course, they leave behind to the tender mercies of the nightmare of terror the poor and the elderly who cannot flee. Who can watch a neighborhood howl with Jewishness and see of Jewish history and events are left to rot? Who does not feel compelled to move to save the Jewish sections with their precious synagogues and institutions that are doomed to be turned into churches, movie houses, or bingo parlors? Who will stop this outrageous plundering of Jewish resources that watches Jewish investments turn into huge losses and see Jewish communal property sold for a fraction of its value? Who grieves over the losses endured by poor and lower middle class people as the property values plummet and that which they hope to live in and keep as an investment in their silver years becomes a hideous fiscal joke? Who worries nights over Jews' exodus that becomes more frequent and whose moves turn into briefer and briefer pauses to catch their breath before the next Hegera? Certainly not those whose standard of living is so high that their neighborhoods are safe from all the plagues that afflict the poor and middle class. And then there is the problem of reverse discrimination. It is a fact that in the name of expiating their own sins, the American establishment has decided to compensate blacks and other minority groups for years of injustice by rewarding them at the expense of the poor and middle-class white. For the Jew, this will be disastrous. All that he had gained as a minority has been gained because of a democratic, competitive merit system. In free and equal competition with others, he has been able to win or lose on his own ability and hard efforts. Now all that is changed. Now we find ethnic quotas being adopted in schools and employment. Does a colleague have a small number of minority students or teachers? It does not matter that a small percentage is the result of open and free competition for entry by the attainment of high grades and scholastic ability. Political pressures and fear of trouble by militant dictators that problems be avoided by disregarding merit and going by ethnic quotas. This can down the Jew. Qualified Jewish high school seniors are denied admittance to first-rate college. There is no room for them because a large number of far less qualified minority group students have been admitted to fulfill the quota. Jewish students are turned down by medical schools while seats are reserved for others who lack the talent but have the desire. Government scholarships are denied Jews because other groups have preference. Today there is preferential treatment, which is a quota system for blacks and Puerto Ricans and Chicanos, and which in itself guarantees the exclusion of a certain number of qualified Jews. Tomorrow, the quota system will reach its logical conclusion with demands that each nationality and ethnic group be admitted on the basis of the national population percentage, and which in effect is against a large number of Jews. For a people that makes up only 3% of the American population, this is political, economic, and social murder. And what is true for schools is likewise happening in employment. Quotas for civil service jobs are demanded, and once again, the Jew is forced out. There are not enough black, Puerto Rican, or Mexican American principals. Let the competitive exams be abolished and hire on the basis of color and ethnic background. More, let the past examinations be disregarded totally or higher, not on the basis of the highest grades, but in alphabetical order. And so we find that Jews who studied long and hard to become administrators, who passed the examinations for these jobs on merit and effort, who waited months and years for an opportunity to emerge, are suddenly told that they are being overlooked because of the quota system. This is death for the Jews. And what is true for government jobs becomes increasingly true for private industry, as preferential treatment is given the minority group member at the expense of someone more qualified, too often a Jew.